want to begin this afternoon by showing you two quotes about support raising. So here's the first one.
About
And, all right, I'm not sure how to make this. And here is the second one. So as you can clearly see, my thoughts on support raising have undergone a rather dramatic shift. I now see support raising as a part of my calling every bit as much as the real work I engage in with missionaries and with churches. I would love to say that this is because I'm so holy now that I'm not at all bothered by asking for money. But the truth is that what has made the difference for me is experience. When we began raising funds for work in missionary care, it was primarily out of expediency. In the nearly 5 years since then, we have had to rely on God at a new level, one that puts us in a position to love and be loved by others in some of the most tangible, concrete ways possible. This has changed me and has prompted me to write this paper for those like that long ago me, those who may be missing out on a greater blessing in their lives because of a distorted understanding of support raising. In this presentation, I will first define support raising and present the biblical justification for support raising as it is generally given in the literature. Then I will expand on that case by examining an underlying framework that can be summarized as Eucharistic interdependence. For the purpose of this presentation, when I use the phrase support raising, I'm talking about work that is done by individual Christians or Christian families who've been called to kingdom building service and who gather the money to meet their personal and or ministry financial needs by directly requesting it from individuals, churches, and organizations. The predominant example, though not the only ones doing this, would be the missionaries seeking funds and building networks to allow for their cross-cultural ministry work. We'll begin looking at the biblical case in the Old Testament. The primary texts here are the Pentateuch's commands for support of the Levites, especially in Numbers 18. There's two aspects of these rules that are applicable to support raising. First of all, the Levites' worthiness to receive support is based on their doing temple work on behalf of all the people. They're not sitting around eating bonbons. They have a specific, important spiritual task that they have been freed up to do by receiving an income from the rest of Israel. The fact that they're actually supported by the people indicates that this job is important enough to set its practitioners apart and have them focus solely on this. Secondly, the support of the Levites is frequently referred to in relation to the people's task of caring for the vulnerable. Both the poor and the Levites prosper as Israel prospers and suffer as Israel suffers. The fate of the nation is thus linked to the fate of its religious workers and to the fate of its most vulnerable citizens. In the New Testament, there are more plentiful passages that come from a wider variety of places, but I've kind of categorized them into four groups. Jesus' teaching, Jesus' example, Paul's teaching, and Paul's example. We'll begin with Jesus' example. So there's four main points to this. First of all, we know from the description in Luke 8:1-3 that Jesus himself lived on support. The creator of the universe, he was living as a man, but he had everything available to him and chose to live in a way that was dependent upon God and on other people. Furthermore, Jesus' relationship with those who were supporting him was not casual. It's not get a gift and go. He, in fact, the women who supported him were with him throughout his earthly ministry and were some of the first people to see him after the resurrection. Supporters. Thirdly, although Jesus had no place to lay his head, he and the 12 were not destitute. They had access to resources. We know this because Judas was watching over a money bag, and the money bag had enough money in it to give to the poor, or to steal from, or to purchase supplies. Those are all things that are mentioned that Jesus' disciples did. Finally, although we in the 21st century may not realize it, the hospitality culture of the first century had implications of support raising. This is because a rabbi's direct request for a donkey or an upper room or a meal was an implied request for support. Culturally speaking, just the act of showing up at someone's house was a revered teacher's way of asking to be housed for 3 days and provisioned for the next stage of the journey. In addition to Jesus' direct example, there are several passages where Jesus' instructions or other teaching relate to support raising. Many organizations link the Great Commission, in particular, to calls for support raising. So, taking the faith to the ends of the earth requires money. Therefore, missionaries and other ministry workers need to raise support. This is sometimes linked to Matthew 6:21 and this idea that where our treasure is, there our hearts are. So, if we care about the Great Commission, we should contribute money to it. It's generally agreed in support-raising literature that Jesus is sending out his disciples without resources, such as purse, bag, money, or bread, is in fact an instruction to live on support. The act of finding the worthy person and entering into their house is in fact a request for provision. The disciples in these passages are in some ways actually using support-raising to identify where the message of Jesus the Christ will be welcome, thus furthering their ministry in every way by looking for their material needs to be cared for by others. Additionally, several authors point to Jesus' statement in Luke 10:7 that the laborer deserves to be paid as an important expression of the idea that missionaries and other Christian workers deserve a salary for the work that they do. Sharing the gospel message requires giving up time, energy, and efforts that could be going toward making a livelihood some other way. In addition to being a specific calling, then, the requirements of Christian service make it a job that deserves compensation like any other. There are several frequently cited passages that refer either directly or indirectly to Paul's life of living on support. These separate into 3 categories: accounts by others that indicated that Paul received support, Paul's words of gratitude for support that he has already received, and Paul's words indicating that he anticipates receiving support in the future. This last group is particularly cited in support-raising literature as indicating that his general expectation and the general mode of operation was to have his financial and material needs met by the various churches. John mentions supporting gospel preachers in order to be co-workers with them, and Peter instructs Christians to share what has been given to them. But in the New Testament, it's Paul who has the most to say that either implicitly or explicitly applies to the practice of support raising. This, perhaps, is why virtually every piece of support-raising literature refers back to Paul's teaching on the subject. First of all, Paul seeks in his teachings to elevate both the work of sharing the gospel and the evangelists themselves. This is particularly notable in 1 Corinthians 9, where he connects Old Testament rules about work and the support of the Levites to indicate that it's God's plan for full-time workers to be supported by the church. In fact, this provision is absolutely necessary for the mission of the church. It's the only way for evangelists to do their work without charging those they come to preach and minister to. The quoting of Jesus' words that the worker is worthy of his hire indicates that there's a concurrence of value there. Merit goes along with recompense and vice versa. Secondly, Paul mentioned that there are great benefits for the one who gives to the work of the gospel. This is a thematic element of 2 Corinthians 8 through 9, but echoes can be found throughout his letters. The ways that giving affects the giver are grounded in the idea that by giving to the church, they are in fact giving to God. This means that giving is an act of worship, which benefits the giver spiritually. There is something inherently honorable and dignified in being able to give, particularly for those who do not have much. Joy is the result of generous giving, as giving allows us to imitate the gracious God who is always giving us what we need. The entire Christian community prospers from this exchange as a spirit of generosity grows through partnership. The final thematic category of koinonia relates directly to those 2 previous categories. One of the greatest benefits that a donor receives is participation in the community they're supporting. In 1 Corinthians 9, there's a clear sense of partnership, of the interdependence of believers. Earlier in that same letter, Paul has indicated that the work of the gospel is a joint venture between God and all the co-workers in God's service. Paul's words in 2 Corinthians 8 through 9 call for this level of koinonia, of fellowship together, that breaks down the gap between Jew and Gentile, between rich and poor, between any groups within the body. What Paul calls for is a kind of solidarity in which the whole community cares for each other, trusting God to care for all of them, and viewing themselves as partners in God's work. This type of mutuality, materially lived out in support raising, is thus a true sacrifice of worship to God. Even as many see Paul as a key proponent of support raising, others point to him as an example of a missionary who makes his own living and thus does not need the support of others. In fact, the description of a ministry worker with a full-time secular job as a tent maker actually comes from places in Acts and 2 Thessalonians where Paul is seen plying his profession. So if holding down a job and doing full-time ministry was good enough for Paul, some say, it should also be good enough for us. Understandably, there's a very strong response to this attitude in the Christian support-raising literature. Paul, it is argued, engaged in this only 3 times that we know of, and each of these 3 had a very specific reason. Paul then sometimes raised support, sometimes supported himself by working full-time at his previous occupation. So what made the difference? Why was and is it okay to sometimes seek provision through others in support raising and sometimes seek provision through self-support? The bottom line is that Paul did whatever was most helpful in the spread of the gospel. Becoming all things to all people in order to save as many as possible applies to support raising as well. While this biblical justification for support raising may be helpful, it can be more fully understood by placing these scriptures and ideas in a larger framework. Some of what I aim to make explicit here is already implicit in the literature, so my goal is just to lay out this underlying schema in a way that's a little bit more conceptually organized. What follows are 5 key assertions that can be summed up in the idea of Eucharistic interdependence. The first key assertion to a biblical theology of support raising is this: out of the loving perichoresis of the Holy Trinity, all things have been made, are sustained, and are apportioned to human beings. Our belief in God as creator, sustainer, giver requires good stewardship of all we have been given. Recognizing God as the source, we use what we have for God's purposes, keeping in mind that God will demand a strict accounting of how we use our wealth at the end. Knowing this, we see wealth as an opportunity to practice both self-control and charity, for it is in generosity that we have an opportunity to partake in God's generous nature toward our own theosis. In addition to avoiding perdition and gaining salvation, the church fathers, who have a lot to say about the proper use of money, write that the generous will receive joy here and now. Thus, both this life and the next are blessed by giving rather than clinging to wealth. I've already mentioned the need to use our resources for God's purposes. But what are those purposes, and how does that relate to support raising? God desires that God's kingdom would be made manifest in the whole world. With his incarnation, Jesus has inaugurated the kingdom. In the end of time, the kingdom will be completely present here on earth as it is in heaven. In the meantime, in the now but not yet kingdom, God is at work. Thus, seeking the kingdom means for us now to look for the places where God is already moving. Connecting this to support raising goes back to our key assertion of God's ownership of all things. Stewards know that their job is to look out for their master's good. The priorities of the master are the priorities of the good steward. Good stewards seek to see God's purposes accomplished in the world. Care for the poor and for gospel workers is one way to offer thanksgiving for all we have been given, even as it shows that we trust in the master to continue to provide all that we need. Indeed, giving of our material resources through support of gospel workers is not a gift to them, but to God through them, for God's purposes. We're all called to participate in what God is doing in the world, using our unique talents, gifts, and resources. This may happen through the cycle of material abundance and grateful giving, just as it may happen through dedication of our occupation and service. We're always mindful, however, as those who give or receive support, that the work is God's, not ours. Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 3, 5-9, "What after all is Apollos, and what is Paul? Only servants, through whom you came to believe, as the Lord assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. For we are co-workers in God's service. You are God's field, God's building. That final verse points us to the third key assertion. The work of God that we are invited into is not meant to be done alone. We are called to pool our resources, to interweave our lives and our efforts. St. Gregory of Nyssa sees the church as an extended family. The most just thing in any family, he says, is to split the resources of the family evenly so that all reap an equal part of the heritage. This relates back to Paul's idea of koinonia, a fellowship that seeks to fill the lack in one part with the abundance of another. This requires, however, that we see ourselves not primarily as individual units, but as parts of a greater whole whose shared life is giving and receiving. All the imagery used by Paul to describe the body points to this interconnectivity, to the diversity and unity that is a necessary part of identity and function. We need each other. Support raising gives us a glimpse of this as we share not only material resources, but spiritual vitality and missionary vision. American culture in particular tells us that we should not talk about money, that we should be self-sufficient, that we should take care of ourselves, that need equals less than. Support raising breaks down the impregnable walls of pride and individuality to remind us that all of us in the end are entirely reliant, entirely dependent on God for all things. In the vulnerability of asking for money, we actually come into greater communion with one another as we recognize our mutual neediness before God. Thus, support raising is a means of grace for us corporately as we join together to do and be that which neither giver nor receiver could do or be alone. Because we are embodied beings, we express our beliefs with our actions. We tell the story of what we value and believe with the way we use our material resources. As members of the body of Christ, we believe that the story we tell with our lives should be one of love for each other and for the world. When it comes to issues of getting and giving support, the concrete, practical, active nature of love is made clear. People who've been called out for service to the gospel of the kingdom do not live on manna. Whether it comes in through institutional apportionment, as is the case with a shrinking number of organizations, through receiving local tithes and offerings, or through personal support raising, the bottom line is the same. Christian workers who've been set apart for the work require financial resources. And yet, they need that money to be given out of relationship, to be given out of genuine care for the person and for the work. Giving financially is seen as an amen from a supporter, evidence that the supporter believes in the receiver and their calling. When a supporter responds to an email update or retweets a picture from the field, these small acts speak volumes. When supporters allow themselves to know and be known in the midst of the terrifying, heart-wrenching, messy, mundane, beautiful details of actual life, it is a gift beyond measure. In summary, if everything that we have is a gift from God, the proper response to the joy of receiving from God is to desire to give in return through participating in God's work in the world as a member of the one body of Christ, actively and practically loving others with our resources. In some ways, this comes back to the essence of stewardship from an Orthodox perspective, entering into a sacramental exchange of offering to and receiving from the Lord. In the Eucharist, we believe we offer bread and wine, and it is transformed into something far greater, given back to us as the very body and blood of Christ. The dance of offering and receiving goes far beyond the altar, however, all the way back to the creation of the world, which God offers to all people, and it also goes forward as those who receive the Eucharist are transformed and gratefully offer their lives to God. One of the ways we do this is living out love the Lord your God through love your neighbor. We seek to grow an interdependent community where we share our resources to work for the kingdom, to build a community of love, to let something happen that's greater than we were individually. On the part of the receiver, support raising is an invitation to lean into God's love for us, expressed through the lives of others. It allows us to live lives of gratitude and trust in God's provision. It also allows the support raiser to build bonds with others that are enriching in 1,000 ways that have nothing to do with money and everything to do with connection and care. On the part of the giver, support raising is an invitation invitation to practical love. Supporters are being invited not just to give money, but to join in vision. Prayer tends to follow money, and so giving is also a way to direct our prayer life toward the work of the kingdom. Support giving is an acknowledgement that money is not the only thing of value, that it is not an end in and of itself, but is a useful tool for the kingdom. Supporting gospel workers is a way to spur spiritual growth, inspiring both a healthy attitude toward resources and a very real entry into the work of the kingdom through offerings. Eucharistic interdependence thus combines the vertical element of offering to and receiving from God with the horizontal aspect of partnership and koinonia. Support raising in this framework keeps the emphasis on God's goodness, God's grace, God's glory, by emphasizing stewardship towards shared vision. That shared vision is for participation in God's now but not yet kingdom, and the calling to live in and for it alone. A vital part of Eucharistic independence framework is focusing not only on the giver, but on the receiver, asking, what is my responsibility as a support raiser? Support raisers have to practice a special kind of stewardship. We're called to practice gratitude when the money comes in and when it does not. When support does not come in, it can mean different things. Maybe we're called to be patient. Maybe we're not connecting with supporters. Maybe this particular project or job is not what we're supposed to do. And maybe none of those things. Our dependence on God as the giver of all good gifts includes gratefully accepting changes of direction, or at least reevaluations, that are sometimes necessary when others do not join us in our vision. Part of stewardship for support raisers is that ability to listen constantly for the Holy Spirit to let us know what our path forward is, without ever losing hope or trust in the Lord. When the money comes in, support raisers' stewardship also includes thinking through where we can show the same generosity we so appreciate in others. Perhaps we will tithe our income toward the support of other ministries. Perhaps we'll give freely of our time and energy to a supporter who is hurting. Either way, we're called to freely give, even as we have freely received. In the framework of Eucharistic interdependence, the support raiser has a responsibility to approach support raising as ministry in and of itself. This affects the means by which we ask for support, because the means must be in line with the koinonia toward the kingdom we desire. This moves away from the idea of support raising as begging or other demeaning tasks, and allows us to joyfully enter into and invite others to enter into true fellowship, even when that is uncomfortable, difficult, or makes our pride itch. From this viewpoint, we can assume that God is at work in others, faithfully share the vision God's given us, and gratefully rejoice in relationship, whether they become financial donors or not. We come to see the request for support as an opportunity to be involved in God's work for both giver and receiver, and we become determined not to cheat anyone of this gift. In light of the Eucharistic interdependence that we are called to, we can echo these words of Henry Nouwen. When those with money and those who need money share a mission, we see a central sign of new life in the Spirit of Christ. We belong together in our work because Jesus has brought us together, and our fruitfulness depends on staying connected with Him. Therefore, we who need money and those who can give money meet on the common ground of God's love. The question for the giver and the receiver is the same. Are we willing to meet together in Eucharistic interdependence for the glory of God and the participation in God's kingdom?
Thank you. Thank you.
We have a little time for questions. Yeah.
I'm going to form my question as I speak, so bear with me. I love your presentation. I love the scripture you use. I love your perspective on it. I'm associated with the Church of Jesus Christ by these things. And we give tithing, we give things like that. Our clergy aren't paid. Interestingly enough, at the commencement of our church, we wanted to establish a theocratic socialistic society where all things were common. And Joseph Smith did receive large funds from private donations where people on their own free will gave to help pay things off, get the church out of debt, and things like that. And I've always admired that because even though we don't practice it now in the fact of paying our bishop, paying our clergy, things like that, those stories are very, very sacred stories within our religion and church history because of just the faith and the camaraderie it did create. I guess the question I have is, has there been any analysis underdone or any statistics to analyze the strength of a particular congregation, a particular area that is engaged in receiving support and people are being very, very generous in their donations and things like that versus the strength of a congregation who is not? Or in addition to that, best practices of somebody who is fulfilling that role of asking people for money, things like that.
So I haven't done a bunch of statistical research on this, so I wish I could say like, yes, this is exactly that. I will say, here's a little case study that I know about. So the Free Methodist Church in America has between 800 and 900,000 members, just in America. That's like a tenth of the Free Methodist Church overall, but that's what's in America. They support over 100 missionary families in the field, and the average giving is between $160 and $170 per capita. So here you've got this denomination that is pretty tiny in comparison to other denominations, but is fielding a really big number of missionaries and giving a lot per capita. And fielding those missionaries, and they also have a really large child sponsorship program. So there are other things. That's not like all of that money isn't going directly into missionaries. And there has historically been, and currently even still is, this missionary fervor that is reflected in the giving. So, it's hard to say, like, it's hard to draw a direct correlation there, but I just think it's really interesting.
It is very interesting. And one thing I love is a lot of people would put us at opposite ends of the spectrum in this regard. But the principles that you taught and the principles that you shared in this article are all things that I've been taught and I've embraced. And to see this as like this big difference right here, all of a sudden actually comes together, and we do it in a little bit of a different way, but it's just, for me, this has been very pleasant to, in an aspect of bridge building.
Yeah, thank God.
Just because it's just been like, man, because this entire time, and outside of it, and I know right now I'm going to talk freely and I'm going to be very, very arrogant, there's this idea of our bishops aren't paid. So there's no greed in the church. There's no this, there's no that.
Right.
And then you put that, if you're arrogant, you just put that on the rest of people, saying, oh, okay, well, because this is part of it, and I'm sure there's some of it that people become ministers for the money, they become this, they become that, they become this. But to see this side of it, for me, has been very, very, very uplifting. And I really do appreciate for what you've done.
Thank God. I'm glad. That's encouraging to my heart to hear.
Yeah, it's sort of really interesting how much, how this works out in different cultures, and you probably, depending on the culture, you have to give a very different kind of thought. I mean, your line that begging means, is shameful, I think is what you said. Immediately, in Buddhist countries, all the monks live by begging, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they go around with the begging bowls every morning and get the,
Yeah.
and it builds up a person's karma, right? If they give to the Buddhist monk. So there's a completely different mindset about giving and receiving.
Need is not a shameful thing.
Right,
in
right,
culture.
in fact. And in fact, actually what happens sometimes is that there really is, this whole support thing becomes, people get crossways because in other cultures it's expected that people with more money will give to those who are less, who have less money, right?
Yeah.
Asian cultures, for example. And when we come together in a denomination where there are people that are both living in the US as well as living in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Africans and Asians say, you Americans have a lot of money, you should give it to us, right? And the
Right.
Americans then get resentful and,
Right.
you could raise your own money.
Yeah.
So it becomes, the conversations become very, very complicated.
Mhm.
I certainly have no solution, but I do know that it can be messy.
Yeah, well, and the history of colonialism
Right.
and how does power work with money and
Mhm.
how to, it is certainly not an easy thing. And I don't have a here is the percentage of your income that you really ought to be tithing to full-time gospel workers in order to,
Right. Yeah, it's very different.
Last comment, I
Yeah.
apologize.
Yeah.
But one thing that you said in your article as you gave kind of like a conflict of, I don't need to be supported, I'm self-sufficient, I'm individual, I don't need to receive from others, and how that's damaging on the spirit. One thing I will say, I love my religion, I love my beliefs, but that is something within our church we suffer from. We fully 100% adopted this idea of, if you're not self-sufficient, then you are less than.
Mhm.
But, and I'm trying so hard to help people see that God has
Yeah.
created diversity because there is so much spiritual benefit in recognizing, receiving, giving. Especially in the truest sense of our religion is, and one day I hope I can live this. Right now we're doing it based off of, the Spirit telling us, what to give and things like that, but we do believe in a theocratic socialistic society where all things are common.
Mhm.
And, you give and take according to your needs and things like that. But it's so interesting how a faith like ours that embraces that, right now, we were forced to adopt a different method, but right now we have adopted a different method, which is working. Church financially has done very, very well, but that conflict that's in there, I have seen within deeply within our congregations.
Mhm. Yeah, that was certainly part for me of my own journey of that, I'm not gonna ask people for money. I mean, that's, as a 22-year-old, I literally prayed that prayer. Lord, I will do anything, I will go anywhere, I will suffer hardship for you, I will say goodbye to friends and family, please don't make me raise support. And I actually, in some ways, am here today because I was unwilling to raise support. And so the 2 job offers that I got, one was in Haiti, and I would have had to raise support, and one was in America at a different ministry, and I didn't have to raise support. And I took that one and met my husband and ended up going to Asbury and ended up at this stage of my journey. So, the Lord can certainly redeem those things. But I wish that I had come sooner to a realization that all of us, all that we have comes from God. It doesn't, the fact that it comes through our supporters, or if we get, if we're doing an entrepreneurial gig later where we're earning income from that, one of those revenue streams comes from the Almighty. So, I'm done preaching.
I'd like you to clarify something. When you said that a church was supporting 100 and some people, by support you mean full support, or that they're just giving to 100 people?
No, that's the number of, that's the denomination supports, I forget the exact number, but it's over 100, it's between 100 and 120 missionary family units are live
Their
entirely
entire
on
support
support.
level.
Yes,
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
I have to write thank you letters every day. So if nothing else, I got this lovely phrase from what you said. Your generosity and our need meet together on the ground of God's love. Well, I'm gonna use that one.
Yeah, that's
Thank
Henry,
you.
that's Henry Nouwen.
Is it?
So be sure, yeah, he, wrote a really beautiful, tiny volume on fundraising called The Spirituality of Fundraising. And I would recommend that everybody in the world read this book. Henry Nouwen, so,
Yeah.
but it also, it has that profound spirit of, we're coming together before God. That's what we do, yeah.
I always think when I think about fundraising we need to do, that it's fair to talk about it as selling too. What we're selling to others in the exchange, if you like, is that people get the story and they want the story.
Yeah.
Because the story many times is uplifting.
Yeah.
Or it's challenging or whatever. A story is valuable.
Yeah.
It's the most important thing that we have.
Yeah.
And as we continue to tell that story, it's amazing how many times in people's lives, the story that they heard somewhere else gives them courage to take the next 2 or 3 steps.
Yeah.
And many times, I find that, donations come because you graciously and generously share the story. You don't say, I'll tell you the story if you give me a couple of bucks.
Right, yeah.
You give the story, and then out of the generosity and need, meet together on the ground of God's love. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.